I think we've talked a little bit about moments of challenge in the past and how inclusion has not always been equitable. And I think, Alita, when we were talking, you said, the United States is like an elastic band, and we have this history of really stretching as we try to achieve equity, and then it bounces back. And so, in thinking about moments of progress or moments where we've achieved equity and how it's bounced back, I'm wondering how each of you think of this moment that we're in, which feels, a little bit like a constant stretching and bouncing back.
Well, I'm very optimistic. And to use the rubber band, analogy, we always stretch the rubber band. It may bounce back, but it always gets bigger. And our challenge is to keep doing it in a way that doesn't make it pop. But in my lifetime, it's been stratospheric. To echo what you were saying about Dr. King, if you've ever seen that documentary From Montgomery to Memphis, I'm that chunky white girl on the back wall at the mountaintop speech. And I was 3 blocks away when my city erupted into flames the next day when Dr. King was slaughtered in my city. And I was downtown, and it changed my life forever. So I look at that, and I look at how my life has changed and how lives of my students and my colleagues have changed, as well as activists. If you had asked me in 1974, when I got canned because they thought I was gay, if I would end up writing policy for a presidential campaign, I would say, are you crazy? If you had asked me if my partner and I could get married on the National Mall by a United States Senator, I would say, are you nuts? The vast majority of my friends have been people of color. And so what I have seen change now in my universe is a much more diverse constituency, a much more overt and public commitment by white women to, in fact, engage in these issues on a policy level, on a rural level, but also on a culture, like a who we are level. And so while I see equal pay as an outrage, while as somebody who ran a rape crisis center, I am off the charts on sexual assault. I look at Senator Gillibrand from New York and the extraordinary work that she is doing in the United States Senate to combat that. I look at my students who are now the majority, women are now the majority of medical students and law students. Do we have major challenges ahead? Absolutely. I don't have children, but I have 21 godchildren. So I look at the struggle of income and balance and time, but I do think, to piggyback on what Ann said, for those of us that want to change it right now, there are a lot of sacrifices that have to be made, but we have policies to guide us. We have community to support us. We know how to work the media. We can own social media to help us. And we can also figure out how to have community that gives us that soul armor, if you will, that sort of Velcro armor, that we need when we're fighting our colleagues in the department who are clueless and who talk 82% as opposed to 70%, to try to get words in. But I think we're here. And if we let up now, all politics aside, look at the number of women right now that are running in this election. We could get 7 women more in the United States Senate. That's huge. But we don't, and just so I got off on culture, I really am a political junkie. But what we really have to do is we are horrible, horrible, horrible at getting women on the local level to step up and take a policy position. Uganda is better than us. Rwanda is better than us. Bosnia is better than us. The Soviet Union, Putin's Russia is better than us. South Africa is better than us. France is better than us. And so we have to figure out how to take our voices and our passion and our support groups and take the risk to write the rules while we're also encouraging people to understand what the rules are and encourage their expansion at the same time.
Well, Andrea, how would you say you understand this moment of elasticity?
Yes, I hope I can be as eloquent as Alita in thinking about the rubber band. So thinking about the rubber band metaphor, I think that my perspective is that there are people who are outside of the rubber band even, right? And so that we need to think about that. And, Alita used the word sacrifice. I think that, this time is a time of profound inequality. So we've got all sorts of economic data. We've got some of the wealthiest people, not only in the United States, in the world, and some of the most impoverished. And so the question then begins to be, I think, what are the sacrifices we need to make, or what are the costs of that profound growth and that profound success for some? And how do we get other people, sort of in the rubber band within its sort of confines and allowing us to sort of stretch it? So I think to be thinking about at what cost my success as a scholar, as a leader, at what costs our success as individuals in this room, what are the costs for the success that we've had, and how do we include others in this sort of larger beloved community remains a constant struggle. And I think that we need to be honest with ourselves and say that it takes sacrifice. So whether that means paying higher wages to people who work in our homes or who do service work that helps to sustain the middle class and elites in this country, whether it means actually being willing to engage young people of color in a way that does not have to include the criminal justice system about their fears and their desires and their wants. I mean, these young people are our future. I think we need to be able to make these sacrifices if we truly want to expand this rubber band.
Thank you. Suzanne, we're going to go to questions in a minute, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this before we do so. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this before we move to questions.
Well, I'm sort of in the business of changing rules that are hard and fast and that some people somewhere thought were fair and reasonable when they were put in place, and which always are left to later generations to come and correct. And I've been working kind of a couple of centuries back and looking at the civilization regulations of the federal government, and not all the federal government, just the Secretary of the Interior. Since 1880, well, from 1880 to 1936, the rules called civilization were put in place and pertained only to American Indians. And that's over a half century of religious suppression and cultural oppression. They outlawed the Sundance and other so-called religious ceremonies. They outlawed the pagan and heathenish ways of a medicine man. They outlawed the interference by anyone, including parents, in the progressive education of the young people, which meant hauling them off to boarding school, going several states away. In my mother's grandparents' day, when they became the first people within the first class of hostage students at the Carlisle Institute in western Pennsylvania. They were taken from Oklahoma and two different places in Oklahoma, one which is on the Kansas-Oklahoma line and another in western Oklahoma, put on trains and sent to Carlisle, and that was in 1778. And they, when they got there, their hair was cut and really short, and they were given uniforms, they were given hard shoes. Everything that was Indian about them was criminalized or otherwise banned. And this, by the way, took place without a law preceding it. Regulations almost always have a law and then regulations to implement that law. But no, here was just a law, or not really, by the Secretary of the Interior in a one-pager called Civilization in 1880, but then it became many, many pages of a slender book, which now is found almost exclusively in the Solicitor's Law Library in the Department of the Interior, just called Civilization. And that was issued in 1884, 1894, 1904, and then continued as Bureau of Indian Affairs commissioners' circulars until the 1930s, when they were withdrawn as part of the Indian New Deal of the Roosevelt administration. And they banned all travel off the reservation without a written note. So if your sacred mountain was off the reservation, and these reservation lines were intended to be flexible. They weren't hard delineated lines. They were lines that accommodated usual and accustomed fishing areas and hunting areas and praying areas. But for sacred places, coupled with a ban on all people under regulations of the Bureau of Indian Affairs that said you couldn't travel any place, they took those lands and, of course, without moving them, transferred them to the jurisdiction of American government agencies, where many remain today. One thing about the most recent rules pertaining to us, which we think are pretty good, and I'm sure people will look at them in about 50 years and say, what were they thinking? But the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples are pretty good rules, and they were developed in this century, starting in last century, and they say in part that if a sacred place was taken from Native peoples without their free, prior, and informed consent, free, prior, and informed consent, I like that, then they should be given back. Now, what does the State Department, the American State Department, say about that? They say, well, that just means consultation, and we can ask, and if we don't like the answer, we can do what we want to do. Well, that's not what free, prior, and informed consent means, is it? So we have a constant battle to bring the United States and its citizenry and all people under its protection into the modern era. And that involves things that we're fighting from centuries ago.